Ludwig Feuerbach, a great name, right? He was a 19th century German philosopher, and he's best known for a concept known as the projection theory of religion. In a nutshell, it was the idea that human beings have inherent needs, and we project, hence the name projection theory, we project these ideas, these needs, these longings onto a God that we create according to our own conception. Essentially, it is a twist on the biblical idea that God made mankind in his image. Feuerbach inverted that arrangement, and he said, no, it's actually God who is made in the image of humanity. Well, Ludwig, I'll give you full merits on your fantastic beer. However, I object very strongly to your concept of God. But that's what we're going to talk about today, this question. I picked an easy question today. Does God exist? Welcome to Deep Wells. We are going to explore ancient insights into enduring questions. And of course, I spoke facetiously when I said that this was an easy question. I mean, wow. Does God exist? The existence of God is probably one of the greatest questions that human beings have grappled with across millennia, and a very difficult question, a very complex question. And so we're going to tackle this. I think we'll probably do more than one episode. We'll see kind of how this develops, but it's a huge question. It's an important question. So was Feuerbach right? Is God, in fact, created in the image of humanity? Or maybe another great thinker, C.S. Lewis, had a better idea. C.S. Lewis, of course, was a well-known British professor, theologian, writer. He's best known for his Chronicles of Narnia series. But he wrote in one of his books, Mere Christianity, the following: if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And I think that's a great way to look at this question. You know, in the natural world, of course, human beings have the greatest mental capacity. That seems to be unarguable. But I don't think that even the next smartest animal, whatever that would be, working our way down, I don't think that there's a point in that chain of intelligence where there's another creature besides humanity that are asking themselves these great existential questions, these great theological questions. I don't think cows wake up in the morning, wander around the pasture and say, hey, I wonder if there's a God out there. I don't think they're thinking along those lines. Hey, maybe I'm wrong. But it seems like within the heart of humanity, there is this longing, this desire to know why we're here, what exists beyond us. And of course, the greatest existence beyond us, the transcendent existence, is God himself. And I think C.S. Lewis was really striking upon an important truth when he said, you know, if we have this hunger, so to speak, this desire on the inside of us for transcendence, it must be that we were created for that transcendence. I think it's a very interesting argument for God, for God's existence. Essentially, it's that we long for such a being as God to exist, and that it's not simply that we need him to exist, but it actually is that longing itself points to the one who transcends us, the one who placed that longing within us. And of course, that's very much in line with the Judeo-Christian tradition. We find this in the Bible, the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures. We find it right in the very first chapter of the Bible. In fact, it says in Genesis 1:26, then God said, let us make humankind in our image and after our likeness. Now, the question of the existence of God is a fascinating one, and I'm going to just take my time I'm not going to try to deliver this to you in a polished way because this is just such a huge question. And some of the greatest minds have grappled with this. So I don't expect to win you over necessarily with one podcast. I mean, I would love to, but maybe you're on the fence about the existence of God. I just want to look at some ideas, explore some ideas. And, there's the question of epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, the limits of knowledge, how we attain knowledge. And when it comes to the question of God, in my opinion, now there would be people that wouldn't agree with this, but in my opinion, in this life, in this world, in this existence as we know it here on this planet, it's really not attainable for us to achieve an exhaustive knowledge of God, or let's say a certainty of God's existence that is unassailable, that is beyond any shadow of a doubt. I think we can get a strong assurance, but I don't think there's ever a time in this world where some possible or even plausible argument against God's existence could not be made. And I think that that's where the interplay of knowledge and faith really happens. Mankind has always struggled with this question. We can look at some of the earliest records that we have, the oldest cultures, the oldest societies, and across the board, what's amazing is the idea of atheism, the idea that this material world really is all that it is, or a materialistic worldview. That is a very, very novel, very new, late arrival on the human scene. For as far back as we have record, even though there's been a variety of opinions on exactly what the nature of the transcendent, the spiritual world, the metaphysical world is, the fact of the matter remains that every culture, every tribe, tongue, without exception, had some idea of a spiritual world, of demons, of evil spirits, angels, jinns, whatever they might be called in the respective cultures. But that existence, or at least the belief of the existence of a spiritual world, a world beyond the material, beyond the sensory world that we live in, that belief is universal until very recent times. Polytheism, this belief in many gods, many supernatural beings, was very prevalent. Some would argue that polytheism was the default and that later developed into monotheism, even as late as the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. Now, obviously, as a person who trusts in the accuracy, the inerrancy of the Bible, I believe that the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, had a belief in God well before Babylon ever occurred, and even right from the very creation, from the inception of the human race, that there was this default for monotheism, the true and living God, and that through sin later diverged into different expressions and idolatry, polytheistic beliefs, that sort of thing. I would say that the polytheism actually came afterward. But regardless, whatever your opinion is on that, we can see that polytheism was very widespread, and the people of Israel, the ancient Hebrews, the descendants of Abraham, they were very, very, unique, I should say, or there's probably a better way to say it. They were exclusive almost in this idea of one true God, this monotheistic perspective. And of course, later that monotheism was really picked up on by the Greek philosophers. We find early signs of that. Socrates was tried as an atheist, and we think of atheist in our modern conception, but Socrates actually was not an atheist at all. He just didn't believe in the gods, the plurality of gods. He really seemed to be leaning into monotheism. He was leaning into, maybe not expressly, but it seems like at least he was kicking the tires on monotheism. He certainly was a a critic of the gods as they were portrayed in the Homeric epics and other literature of the time. And so he rejected this idea of these petty, cruel, deceptive, immoral gods that were fighting and killing each other and emasculating each other and raping and just all the stuff that we read about in Greek literature. He was rejecting those ideas, those conceptions of God. And Socrates, well, we could say that in that sense, Feuerbach was right. The Greek gods are a perfect reflection of gods that were, in fact, reflective of human beings, the way that we live in our fallen state. But Socrates was really pushing against that and saying, in essence, if God exists, he can't be anything like these depictions of God, of the gods that we have in our literature. And he spoke often in the singular of the God, ho theos, and that's documented in Plato's Apologia. But it's interesting how the Greek philosophers were starting to move into even rational arguments for the existence of God. In an early Christian writing, I think this is interesting, picking up on the Greek philosophers. There's a writing called Octavius. It was written by Minucius Felix, and in that writing, the character Octavius asserted this. I love this quote. It's just so fascinating. He said, "One might suppose either that Christians of today are philosophers, or that philosophers of old were already Christians." So he's making this argument that the philosophers were ahead of the times. They were ahead of the ball in terms of monotheism, and that they were actually anticipating what later was revealed through Jesus Christ and his teachings. I think that's a very, very interesting. Another one of the arguments that's made for the existence of God, and we'll probably go through several of these. I'm just wanting to present them. I think this one really ties in with what we're talking about today specifically, but it's what I would call the ideal argument for God, the concept of the forms and the ideals in Greek philosophy, and this idea that there are ultimate realities that transcend the manifestations that we see in our world. And so the idea of ultimate beauty, ultimate truth, ultimate goodness, the highest form of good, the highest form of beauty, the highest form of truth. Plato talked about that, talked about the forms that, that these concepts of beauty, truth, goodness are objective and eternal, and that they're perfect and they exist in the transcendent realm. And in the Republic, Plato described the form of the good as the supreme form. So it's this kind of idea of a chain of causation. We see the manifestations of beauty, goodness, truth, and ultimately, if you were to follow the source to the ultimate, there would be an ultimate good, ultimate beauty, ultimate truth, and that very much conforms to what we would call God, these conceptions of the ultimate being. Are you staying with me? I mean, these are these are some pretty heady. I'm telling you, I told you at the beginning of the podcast, this was going to be kind of a deep thinking podcast, but it's just really interesting. These ideas are really worth looking into and thinking about. So, following that link, that chain of causation, we would see that there would ultimately, this was Plato's argument, that we would ultimately find the purest form, the unadulterated goodness, beauty, truth. And of course, the Christian writers that followed, picked that up. I should mention Plotinus. He was a 3rd century Neoplatonist writer, philosopher, and he kind of echoed these ideas. He talked about the one, what we would call God, the being, the ultimate one. The one, again, entirely transcendent, perfect, indivisible, from which all other existence emanates, the creator. And Plotinus explicitly associated that one with good, with beauty, and again, pointing toward a single source. Those ideas were picked up by Christian writers very early on. Augustine of Hippo would be one that picked up on that later on. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Again, these properties, goodness, truth, nobility, imply the existence of a maximum standard, an ultimate, we could say transcendent standard, which Christians would identify as God. But I think it's a compelling argument. It's a compelling argument if beauty exists, if truth exists, if goodness exists, then they must have a pure form, which is their ultimate source. And I would argue that that source is God. It is God. So we'll take a look at this. We've kind of got a start today. This argument I just gave you, I call it the ideal argument. There may be a more technical term for it. It's closely related to the transcendental argument for God, although the transcendental argument is more often argued from the standpoint of absolute ethical standards, absolute moral standards, but it's kind of really tied in. It's similar. Hey, if you're interested in all this stuff, great book I want to recommend to you. It's A History of Western Philosophy by Dr. C. Stephen Evans. He was, and maybe still is, the chair, I believe, of the philosophy department at Baylor University. That's a great book. It's very readable. It's a big book, but don't let it intimidate you. He covers a lot of ground, about 2,500 years of philosophy, but really, I think gives it a fair treatment. It's very readable, very interesting. So if you're interested in digging into some of these big philosophical ideas, I would really highly recommend that book. It's a great resource. Maybe next time we'll get into some of these other arguments for the existence of God. It's a huge question. Does God exist? Clearly, I believe so. You may not be so sure, but I hope we can continue the conversation. I hope this has been interesting to you, informative, insightful, maybe provocative in some ways, but I hope it got you thinking.